January 1945. Somewhere in the ruins of the Rhineland, where winter fog clings to shattered stone and the acrid smell of antiseptic mingles with the stench of old death, German military nurse named Katha Reinhardt stood in the doorway of a requisitioned field hospital, her hands still trembling from the morning's work. Behind her, rows of wounded soldiers lay on blood-stained linen, their groans a constant backdrop to the rhythm of war. Before her, across a muddy courtyard littered with spent shell casings and abandoned equipment, American medical personnel moved with a precision that seemed almost theatrical. They carried plasma bags she had only read about in journals from before the war. They operated portable X-ray machines she had never seen outside of Munich's University Hospital. And they did all of this while whistling. She had been a nurse for 6 years. She had worked through the siege of Stalingrad's hospitals, through the endless winter of 1942, when morphine ran out and they used vodka and prayer instead. She had learned to amputate with a handsaw when the surgical instruments were lost in a retreat. She had memorized which arteries could be clamped with her fingers and which required immediate cauterization with whatever heat source remained. She had become, in the peculiar alchemy of total war, something between a healer and a butcher. And now, watching the Americans unpack crate after crate of medical supplies with the casual abundance of men unloading groceries, she felt something she had not experienced in years. She wept, not from sadness, not from relief, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that her entire medical education, her entire professional existence, had been a makeshift approximation of what medicine was supposed to be. The Americans had invited her and 17 other German medical staff to observe their surgical theater. To learn, they said, as if there were no war, no defeat, no ideology separating the white coats from the field gray uniforms still hanging in the adjacent barracks. Just medicine, just the work. The invitation itself was absurd in its simplicity. 3 days earlier, as German resistance in the region collapsed, and American forces moved through the network of field hospitals and aid stations, a U.S. Army Medical Corps colonel named Thomas Westfield had done something his superiors had not explicitly ordered, but had not forbidden either. He had gathered the German medical staff, mostly nurses, a handful of orderlies, 2 surgeons who looked as though they had not slept in weeks, and through a translator, made an offer. Come watch, come learn, bring your questions. We will show you everything. The German senior surgeon, Dr. Heinrich Bauer, a man whose hands had performed over 3,000 battlefield amputations since 1941, had stared at the American colonel with the expression of someone who suspects a trap but cannot identify its mechanism. Why? He had asked. The translator rendered it precisely, warum? Colonel Westfield, a man who had overseen combat surgery from North Africa through Sicily and into France, who had performed operations in foxholes and bombed out churches, who had lost count of how many soldiers he had saved and how many he had watched die despite his best efforts, had answered with equal simplicity, because you're going to be taking care of these people long after we leave, and they deserve the best medicine we can give them, all of them. This answer, preserved in Westfield's personal correspondence and later in the unit's medical logs, represented something the German medical staff had not encountered in years. Medicine divorced from ideology, healing separated from the apparatus of state control. It was not propaganda. It was not a strategic maneuver. It was simply what American military doctrine, rooted in a particular vision of universal human dignity, demanded. Even here, even now, even for the enemy. To understand why this invitation shattered Katha Reinhardt and her colleagues, one must step back to the medical reality of the Third Reich's final years. By 1945, German military medicine had devolved into a grim exercise in triage without resources, surgery without supplies, and care without hope. The systematic collapse of medical infrastructure began not in 1945 but in 1943, when Allied bombing campaigns destroyed pharmaceutical plants, when supply lines fractured, when the Eastern Front consumed men and materials faster than any industrial system could replenish them. German military hospitals, once models of efficient organization and scientific rigor, became monuments to improvisation. Nurses like Kata had learned to reuse bandages until they disintegrated. They boiled instruments in water contaminated by debris because there was no alternative. They performed surgery by candlelight when generators failed. They watched gangrene claim limbs that could have been saved with antibiotics that no longer existed in their supply chains. Penicillin, the miracle drug that British and American medics dispensed with casual abundance, remained a near mythical substance in German military medicine. Some nurses had heard rumors of it. Some had seen captured supplies. None had access to quantities sufficient for routine use. The surgical techniques that had once defined German military medicine, the careful, methodical procedures documented in pre-war medical texts, had been replaced by brutal efficiency. Dr. Bauer's 3,000 amputations were not a testament to skill, but to the absence of alternatives. Without plasma for transfusions, without antibiotics for infection control, without the basic supplies that allowed damaged limbs to heal, amputation became the default solution. Cut away the dying tissue before it kills the whole patient. This was the calculus of German military medicine in 1945. Crude, desperate, effective only in the narrowest sense of keeping some soldiers alive. The nurses absorbed this degradation into their professional identities. They learned not to hope for better outcomes because hope was a liability in an environment where resources shrank daily. They learned to measure their success not by recovery rates, but by how many men left the hospital alive, even if maimed, even if permanently broken. They learned to close their hearts to suffering because the alternative was madness. Kathe Reinhardt, writing in a diary she kept hidden until 1983, described the transformation. We became machines of minimal mercy. We did what could be done and trained ourselves not to imagine what should be done. That space between the possible and the necessary, that is where our humanity drowned. The Americans arrived with a different medicine. Entirely, when the 32nd Field Hospital established operations in the captured German facility, they brought with them the full apparatus of American military medical logistics: portable generators, electric surgical lights, stainless steel instruments in sterile packaging, plasma by the case, whole blood for transfusions, penicillin in quantities that seemed obscene to the German staff, sulfa drugs, morphine, ether, surgical gloves, disposable syringes. They brought X-ray machines that could be set up in 30 minutes. They brought portable laboratory equipment for blood typing and bacterial cultures. They brought surgical techniques developed in stateside hospitals and refined through 3 years of combat experience across 2 theaters of war. But more than equipment, they brought a philosophy of care that seemed alien to the German medical staff. American military medicine, shaped by a democratic ideology that insisted on the fundamental worth of every individual, operated under a different calculus than its German counterpart. The goal was not merely to return soldiers to combat, though that was certainly a priority. The goal was to restore maximum function, to preserve quality of life, to treat each casualty as a person whose future beyond the war mattered. This meant longer surgeries, more complex procedures, aggressive use of new antibiotics, extensive rehabilitation planning. It meant, in the cold arithmetic of military efficiency, spending more resources per casualty. And the Americans spent them without apparent hesitation. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, an Army nurse from Ohio who kept detailed personal records later donated to the National World War II Museum, described the German nurses' first visit to the American surgical theater. They stood in the observation area. We'd set up a gallery where they could watch through the windows, and at first they were just silent, watching, taking notes. But about 20 minutes into the first surgery, one of them, a woman in her 30s, started crying. Not sobbing, just tears running down her face while she kept writing in her notebook. I went up to ask if she was all right, and she grabbed my hand and said in broken English, "You saved the leg. You try to save the leg." Like it was a revelation. Like we were doing something radical instead of just standard procedure. The surgery in question involved a German soldier with a badly shattered femur, the kind of injury that in German military medicine would have resulted in immediate amputation. The American surgical team, led by Captain James Mitchell, spent 4 hours cleaning the wound, removing bone fragments, setting the fracture with internal fixation, a technique that required specialized plates and screws, and saturating the tissue with penicillin. The soldier would walk with a limp, Mitchell explained through the translator, but he would walk. He would go home to his family with both legs. He would not spend his life as an amputee. For the German nurses, this was a confrontation with a truth they had been forced to forget. Medicine was not supposed to be what they had been practicing. Medicine was supposed to be what they were witnessing. Meticulous, generous with resources, oriented toward restoration rather than mere survival. The gap between these two realities, between what they had been doing and what could be done, produced a grief that manifested as tears, as sleepless nights, as questions that had no comfortable answers. Käthe Reinhardt attended every surgical demonstration the Americans offered over the following 10 days. She watched them perform reconstructive procedures on facial wounds, procedures that required hours of delicate work and left the patients with scars instead of catastrophic deformities. She watched them treat burn victims with new techniques involving saline baths and skin grafts. She watched them administer penicillin for infections that she knew, from hard experience, would have been death sentences in German military hospitals. And she documented everything in her diary with the precision of someone bearing witness to both revelation and indictment. "We were told that shortages were universal," she wrote, "that everyone was suffering equally under the conditions of total war. But here were the Americans, our enemies, treating our soldiers with a level of care we could not provide to our own. The penicillin alone, they used more in a single day than we had seen in 6 months. This was not efficiency. This was not military medicine as we understood it. This was abundance. This was the medicine of a nation that did not have to choose between bullets and bandages, between tanks and antibiotics. They had both, in quantities we could not imagine. The symbolic weight of penicillin in these encounters cannot be overstated. For the German medical staff, penicillin represented everything their nation had failed to achieve. Discovered by a British scientist, mass-produced by American pharmaceutical companies using industrial processes that Germany's fractured economy could not replicate, distributed with the logistical efficiency that defined American military operations, penicillin was more than a drug. It was a tangible manifestation of the industrial, economic, and ideological gulf separating the Allies from the Axis. When American medics casually administered injections that would save lives otherwise lost to infection, when they treated penicillin not as a precious resource to be hoarded, but as a standard tool to be used liberally, they were demonstrating a form of power that had nothing to do with firepower. They were demonstrating the power of a system that could produce abundance, that could translate scientific discovery into mass production, that could deliver sophisticated medical care to the front lines of a global war. For nurses who had spent years rationing morphine and reusing bandages, this abundance was both miraculous and damning. Dr. Heinrich Bauer, the senior German surgeon, experienced his own collapse of certainty during a training session focused on blood transfusion protocols. The Americans had brought with them not only whole blood, but the entire apparatus of modern transfusion medicine. Refrigeration units to store blood, precise typing and cross-matching procedures, sterile tubing and needles, plasma as a substitute when whole blood was unavailable. They explained their system with the ease of men discussing a routine practice. Blood drives on the home front, voluntary donation, centralized processing, refrigerated transport, distribution networks that could deliver fresh blood to field hospitals within days of collection. Bauer, who had performed countless surgeries without adequate blood supplies, who had watched patients die from shock and hemorrhage that transfusions could have prevented, who had been forced to prioritize the most viable cases because there was not enough blood for everyone. Listen to this explanation with the expression of a man confronting a reality he had not wanted to acknowledge. After the session, according to the account of the American translator Private Daniel Cohen, Bauer asked a question: "How many donors do you have?" The answer: millions. Voluntary donors across America. giving blood for soldiers they would never meet, for a war effort they supported not through compulsion, but through civic commitment. The Red Cross alone, the American medical officers explained, had collected over 13 million pints of blood since the start of the war. It was a national project, a collective act of civilian participation in the war effort. Bauer, according to Cohen's later testimony, sat down heavily and did not speak for several minutes. When he finally did, his words were simple. "We were told that individualism made you weak, that your system was chaotic and inefficient, but you have accomplished something we could not. You have made millions of citizens into voluntary participants in the preservation of life. We had only compulsion, and we ran out of everything." This admission, documented in Cohen's journal and later corroborated by other witnesses, reveals the ideological earthquake occurring beneath the medical training. The German medical staff had been educated in a system that insisted on the superiority of centralized control, that mocked democratic societies as disorganized and weak, that promised efficiency through authoritarian coordination. And yet here, in the concrete details of blood banks and penicillin distribution and surgical supply chains, the Nazi ideology was being refuted by simple logistical facts. The Americans could do more with volunteers than Germany could do with compulsion. The Americans could produce abundance while Germany produced scarcity. The Americans could extend sophisticated medical care to everyone, including enemy prisoners, while Germany's own soldiers died for lack of basic antibiotics. The democratic system that Nazi ideology dismissed as decadent and inefficient had proven itself superior in the most tangible ways possible. In saved lives, in preserved limbs, in soldiers who would go home whole instead of shattered. The training sessions continued for 12 days, until the American medical units received orders to move forward with the advancing front. In that time, the German medical staff received an education that went far beyond surgical techniques. They learned that American military hospitals performed routine appendectomies on soldiers with non-combat ailments, rather than letting minor conditions worsen for lack of resources. They learned that American medics carried morphine in quantities sufficient to manage pain aggressively, that pain relief was considered a medical priority and not a luxury. They learned that American surgical protocols included extensive follow-up care planning, that rehabilitation was considered part of treatment, that the goal was not just survival, but recovery. Lieutenant Brennan documented several moments of culture shock in her diary. An older German nurse, identified only as Margaret, asked why the Americans wasted time on reconstructive facial surgery for injuries that were not life-threatening. Brennan's response, filtered through the translator, "Because he has to live with that face for the rest of his life. Because how he looks matters to his recovery, to his ability to rejoin society, to his mental health. Because we can do better than just keeping him alive." Margaret's reaction, according to Brennan, stunned silence, then tears, then a whispered phrase that the translator rendered as, "We forgot that they were people." Whether she meant the patients, or herself and her colleagues, or all of them, Brennan did not know. But the weight of that realization, that the machinery of total war had reduced human beings to units to be processed, problems to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimum resources, hung over the entire exchange. Another German nurse, younger, asked about the portable X-ray machines with the curiosity of someone encountering alien technology. How did they power them? How did they transport them? How many did each field hospital have? The answers revealed another dimension of American material abundance. They had multiple units per hospital, with spare parts, with trained technicians, with portable generators to ensure continuous operation. The technology itself was not uniquely American. X-ray machines existed in German hospitals, but the ability to deploy them routinely in field conditions, to treat them as standard equipment rather than precious resources, demonstrated an industrial capacity that made the younger nurse shake her head in disbelief. "We were told you were on the verge of collapse," she said, "that your economy was failing, that your people were starving, that your military was sustained only by British support. But you have more of everything. How is that possible?" The question was rhetorical, or perhaps simply unanswerable in the moment. But it pointed to the fundamental deception at the heart of Nazi wartime propaganda: the insistence that Germany's enemies were weak, decadent, incapable of sustained effort. The German medical staff had believed, because they had been told and had no reason to doubt, that everyone was suffering equally, that medical shortages were universal, that the Americans and British were as desperate and improvised as they were. The training sessions demolished that belief with the weight of physical evidence. The Americans were not desperate. They were not improvised. They were organized, supplied, and operating with a level of material support that revealed Germany's claims of technological and industrial superiority to be hollow. Colonel Westfield, in a letter to his wife dated February 3, 1945, reflected on the impact of the training program. We set out to teach them some surgical techniques, to help them provide better care for their remaining casualties and for the civilian population that will need medical attention in the coming months. But what's happening is something larger. These German nurses and doctors are confronting the reality of what their nation has become, what it has done to them as medical professionals. They went into medicine to heal, and they've been forced to operate in conditions that make genuine healing almost impossible. When Nurse Reinhardt, the one who cried on the first day, asked me yesterday why we were helping them, I told her the truth. Because the war is ending, and healing has to begin somewhere. She said something I keep thinking about. She said, "You are showing us what we might have been." I think she meant as doctors and nurses, but maybe she meant something bigger. Maybe she meant as a nation, as a people. I don't know. But watching these professional healers reclaim some sense of possibility, some hope that medicine can be more than triage and amputation, feels like important work. Maybe more important than some of the combat surgery I've done. Westfield's intuition was correct. The training sessions were accomplishing something beyond the transfer of medical knowledge. They were offering the German medical staff a glimpse of an alternative system, an alternative set of values, an alternative understanding of what human society could prioritize and achieve. In the midst of military occupation, in the context of total defeat, the Americans were demonstrating not through propaganda but through practice that their system could afford compassion, could sustain abundance, could treat even enemies with dignity. This was not mercy in the sense of withholding punishment. It was something more fundamental: the extension of professional standards and human decency across the lines of nationality and ideology. The German medical staff were not being punished for their nation's crimes. That reckoning would come through other mechanisms, through tribunals and occupation policies and the hard process of denazification. Instead, they were being offered inclusion in a community of practice, a professional brotherhood and sisterhood that transcended politics. "You are healers," the Americans seemed to be saying. "We are healers." The work itself demands certain standards, certain values, and those values are not German or American, but universal. This is what medicine should be. Learn it, practice it, preserve it. The symbolic object that recurred throughout these encounters was not a weapon or a sound, but a simple medical item: the disposable syringe. American medics used them constantly, pulling them from sterile packaging, administering injections, disposing of them without a second thought. To the German nurses, accustomed to reusing syringes until they dulled, until they risked infection from imperfect sterilization, the disposable syringe became a token of impossible abundance. Kathy Reinhardt wrote about watching an American medic throw away a used syringe, tossing it into a waste bin as if it were nothing, and feeling a surge of something like anger mixed with grief. "We would have boiled that syringe, used it 10 more times, 20 more times, until it broke," she wrote. "And here they use it once and throw it away, as if syringes grow on trees, as if the world has infinite needles and infinite glass." I wanted to retrieve it from the waste bin. I wanted to save it, to bring it back to our supplies. But I knew it was contaminated, unusable. So I just stood there, watching this tiny act of waste that was actually an act of perfect medical practice, and I understood for the first time how poor we had become. Not just in materials, but in imagination. We had forgotten that medicine could be practiced this way. The disposable syringe, multiplied across hundreds of observations, became the emblem of the gulf separating American and German medicine. It represented a system wealthy enough, organized enough, industrially sophisticated enough to prioritize single-use sterile equipment over the risks of reuse. It represented the long supply chains, the functioning factories, the intact transportation networks that could deliver such items to field hospitals. It represented a society that had not been bombed into dysfunction, that could sustain both a massive military and a massive medical infrastructure simultaneously. For Dr. Bauer, the recurring symbol was different. The plasma bag. Americans used plasma liberally, hanging bags for patients in shock, for patients who had lost blood, for patients who simply needed fluids. Plasma, which German military medicine had access to only sporadically, appeared in American field hospitals by the case. Bauer watched the Americans transfuse plasma into a German soldier with multiple shrapnel wounds, watched the man's blood pressure stabilize, watched him survive injuries that would have been fatal without such intervention. And something broke in the surgeon's carefully maintained professional detachment. In a recorded conversation with Private Cohen, preserved in the Army's historical archives, Bauer said, "I have performed 3,000 amputations. I have told myself each time that there was no other choice, that I was saving lives. But watching you save that man's leg, watching you use these resources so freely, I must confront the truth. I have been amputating for years because we did not have plasma. We did not have antibiotics. We did not have the materials that make limb salvage possible. Those 3,000 men did not lose their limbs to war wounds. They lost them to our nation's failures. And I was the instrument of that failure." This was the transformation occurring in the German medical staff. The recognition that their professional compromises, necessary as they seemed in context, were actually the consequences of a system that had prioritized conquest over care, ideology over infrastructure, military glory over medical science. They had been told sacrifices were necessary, that Germany was surrounded by enemies, that resources must go to weapons first and everything else second. They had accepted this logic because they had no alternative, because dissent was dangerous, because the system allowed no space for questioning. But now, confronted with an enemy whose medical system was clearly superior, whose resource allocation clearly prioritized care even for enemy wounded, the logic collapsed. On February 6, 1945, the American medical units received their orders to move out. Colonel Westfield gathered the German medical staff one final time in the cold morning light of a February dawn. He gave them, through the translator, the supplies he could spare: several cases of penicillin, plasma, sterile bandages, surgical gloves, a dozen disposable syringes, 2 portable sterilization units. He gave them copies of the American Army's medical manuals, technical documents describing procedures and protocols. He gave them contact information for the military government that would soon administer the region, told them to request more supplies through official channels, promised that the occupation authorities would ensure medical facilities remained functional. And then, in a gesture that surprised his own staff as much as the German medical personnel, he shook hands with each of them. Not a perfunctory gesture, but a deliberate act of professional recognition. Doctor to doctor, nurse to nurse, healer to healer. "You did good work in impossible conditions," he said through Cohen. "Now you have a chance to do it properly. Take care of these people." Katha Reinhardt, in her diary entry for that day, recorded the moment with characteristic precision. "The American colonel shook my hand, looked me in the eye, and treated me as a colleague. Not as an enemy, not as a defeated German, but as a nurse. I had not been seen that way, as a professional, as a person whose work had dignity, in longer than I can remember. In our system, we were functionaries, cogs in the machine, valued only for our productivity. And here was the enemy, treating me with more respect than my own military had shown in years." I shook his hand and I could not speak because I was crying again. Everyone was crying. Even Dr. Bauer, who I had never seen show emotion, had tears in his eyes. We stood there in the cold, these defeated Germans and these victorious Americans, and we cried together over what medicine should be, and what it had become, and what it might be again. The Americans departed, their convoy of trucks and ambulances rolling toward the next crisis, the next wave of casualties, the next field hospital to establish. The German medical staff remained, surrounded by the supplies the Americans had left, standing in a facility that now seemed both better equipped and infinitely more haunted than it had been 2 weeks earlier. They had knowledge now, techniques, protocols, but they also had questions that would take years to process. How had their nation brought them to this? How had medicine been degraded into such desperate improvisation? How could they practice healing in a society that had so thoroughly embraced death? In the weeks and months that followed, the German medical staff attempted to implement what they had learned. Käthe Reinhardt's diary chronicles the struggle, trying to maintain sterile techniques with diminishing supplies, trying to practice the careful surgical protocols without adequate equipment, trying to preserve the vision of what medicine should be in an environment that continued to deteriorate. By March, as Germany's final collapse accelerated, even the supplies the Americans had left were running low. By April, Reinhardt was back to reusing bandages, back to operating without penicillin, back to the desperate calculations of triage, without resources. But something had changed, some internal measure of what was acceptable and what was failure. Where before she had accepted the conditions as inevitable, now she documented each shortage, each compromise, each patient who died or suffered for lack of supplies that she knew existed somewhere in the world. Her diary from April 1945 reads like an indictment. We lost a 14-year-old boy today to a simple infection that penicillin would have cured in 3 days. We have no penicillin. The Americans gave us 3 cases, and they are gone, used up treating the endless stream of wounded and sick that now includes civilians fleeing the Eastern Front. I tried to save him with sulfa drugs, with hot compresses, with prayer. None of it worked. He died in the night calling for his mother. I have seen thousands die. But this one I cannot shake, because I know that he did not have to die. That somewhere in this world there is enough penicillin to have saved him. But not here. Not for us. Not anymore. The transformation in her consciousness was complete. She could no longer accept suffering as inevitable. She could no longer practice medicine without feeling the weight of what was missing. What could be done if only the resources existed? The Americans had given her knowledge, but they had also given her a burden. The awareness of possibility. The understanding that medicine could be better. That societies could choose to prioritize healing. That abundance was achievable if values were properly ordered. Dr. Bauer's transformation took a different form. In a letter to his wife, written in May 1945 after Germany's surrender and preserved in family archives, he reflected on the implications of what he had witnessed. I believed that I was serving medicine by serving the state, that by doing my duty, by saving the soldiers I could save, I was fulfilling my oath as a physician. But the Americans showed me that there is a medicine above states, a practice that answers to standards higher than national ideology. They treated our wounded with the same care they gave their own, not because of propaganda or strategic calculation, but because their understanding of medicine demanded it. They practiced a healing that recognized shared humanity even in the midst of war. I do not know if I can ever practice medicine again, knowing how far I strayed from those principles, knowing that I accepted conditions, compromises, degradations that should never have been acceptable. I am a surgeon who has lost his moral legitimacy, even if I never lose my technical skill. Bauer did continue practicing medicine, working in civilian hospitals in the American occupation zone until his death in 1967. But his post-war writing, particularly a 1952 essay titled The Ethics of Medical Compromise, reveals a man permanently marked by the encounter with American military medicine. He argued that medical professionals have a duty to resist systems that degrade care, that the acceptance of inadequate conditions is itself a moral failure, that healers must maintain their allegiance to universal standards even when states demand otherwise. It was a philosophy born from the trauma of recognizing his own complicity, his own acceptance of conditions that should have been intolerable. The story of these German nurses and doctors weeping at American medical abundance spread through the post-war years in complex ways. Some accounts emphasized it as evidence of German suffering under the Nazi regime, positioning the medical staff as victims of their own government's failures. Other accounts used it as proof of American moral superiority, a demonstration that democratic societies produced better outcomes even in the midst of war. The actual participants, in their later testimonies and memoirs, resisted both interpretations. They insisted that what they had experienced was not victimhood or propaganda, but confrontation with their own compromises, with their nation's failures, with the reality that ideology had blinded them to the costs of the system they served. Käthe Reinhardt, interviewed in 1978 for a West German television documentary on wartime medical service, was asked if she felt liberated by the American arrival. Her answer was characteristically precise. Liberated is the wrong word. I felt revealed. All the lies we had told ourselves about why we were suffering, about how everyone was suffering equally, about how we were doing the best anyone could do, those lies were stripped away. And underneath was just the truth. We had participated in a system that chose destruction over care, conquest over healing, ideology over human welfare. The Americans did not liberate me from that knowledge. They forced me to confront it. That is not liberation. That is judgment. This refusal of easy redemption, this insistence on bearing witness to complicity rather than claiming victimhood, characterized many of the post-war testimonies from German medical personnel who had interacted with Allied medical units. They recognized that the technical training they received was inseparable from an ideological reckoning, that learning proper medical procedures was also learning about the values that sustained those procedures: respect for individual human worth, commitment to universal standards of care, belief in abundance rather than scarcity as an organizing principle. The symbolic resonance of disposable syringes and plasma bags extended into post-war German memory in unexpected ways. Medical supply companies in West Germany began producing disposable medical equipment in the 1950s, marketing them explicitly as American-style products that represented modern, efficient, hygienic practice. The adoption of single-use medical supplies became, in the peculiar alchemy of post-war reconstruction, a way of aligning German medical practice with Western standards, of demonstrating that German medicine had rejoined the community of nations committed to high-quality care. It was a material manifestation of ideological reorientation, choosing abundance over scarcity, openness over isolation, international standards over national ideology. The epilogue to this encounter between German and American military medicine extends beyond individual transformations. It speaks to the power of material reality to refute ideology, the capacity of simple logistical facts to undermine propaganda. The German medical staff had been educated in a system that insisted on German superiority, on the weakness of democratic societies, on the inevitable victory of centralized control over chaotic individualism. And then they watched American medics use disposable syringes, watched American surgeons save limbs with abundant antibiotics, watched American supply chains deliver sophisticated equipment to forward positions, and the ideology collapsed under the weight of observable fact. This was not a victory of propaganda over propaganda. It was a victory of functioning systems over dysfunctional ones, of societies that could produce both guns and butter over societies that had sacrificed all butter for guns. The Americans did not need to make ideological arguments because their material abundance made the argument for them. Every plasma bag, every dose of penicillin, every disposable syringe testified to the success of a system that the Nazi ideology had dismissed as weak and degenerate. The tears that Käthe Reinhardt and her colleagues shed were tears of recognition that they had been lied to, that their sacrifices had been unnecessary, that another world was possible where healers had the resources to heal properly. Those tears were also grief for the patients they had failed to save, grief for the compromises they had accepted, grief for the professional ideals they had been forced to abandon in service to a system that valued victory over care. in the cold February light of 1945, standing in a requisitioned hospital in the Rhineland, watching American medical personnel pack up their supplies and move toward the next crisis, the German nurses and doctors experienced a truth that would shape the rest of their lives. That medicine, practiced properly, requires a society that values healing, that sustains abundance, that treats individual human life as worthy of resources and effort. The Americans had demonstrated this truth not through words but through practice, not through ideology but through the simple, powerful evidence of working systems. And in that demonstration lay a larger truth about freedom and democracy that no amount of Nazi propaganda could refute. That societies organized around human dignity, that respect individual worth, that allow for dissent and creativity and voluntary cooperation, can achieve what authoritarian systems cannot. They can produce abundance. They can sustain compassion. They can practice healing even in the midst of war. This was the lesson written in disposable syringes and plasma bags, in surgical techniques and supply chains, in the American medic's casual generosity, with resources that German medicine could not access. It was a lesson about the material consequences of ideological choices, about the real-world outcomes of different visions of human society. The German nurses wept because they saw, finally and irrefutably, what they had lost by following a system that promised strength and delivered only scarcity, that demanded sacrifice and gave back only suffering, that insisted on superiority while producing inferiority in every measurable dimension. They wept because the enemy had proven to be the better healer. And in a profession dedicated to preserving life, that was the most devastating defeat of all. Years later, in the quiet of peacetime practice, Käthe Reinhardt would try to articulate what that February in 1945 had meant. She wrote, in an unpublished memoir discovered after her death in 1986. The Americans taught us surgical techniques, transfusion protocols, sterile procedures, but what we really learned was that our entire understanding of necessity had been shaped by scarcity that need not have existed. We had accepted that medicine must be crude and desperate because we had no alternative. But the alternative was always there, just organized around different values, different priorities, different understandings of what human beings owe to one another. The Americans showed us not just better medicine, but a better vision of what society can be when it chooses care over conquest. That is why we wept, not from gratitude, not from relief, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that we had been living in a poverty, material and moral, that our own choices had created, and that other choices were possible. That is the knowledge I carried for the rest of my life. The knowledge of alternative possibility. The understanding that suffering is not inevitable when societies choose differently. The Americans gave us that knowledge whether we wanted it or not. And it changed everything.